to International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
And I call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I move the motion relating to International Holocaust Remembrance Day in the terms in which it appears in the notice paper. The 27th of January marked 76 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. As each year passes, as fewer survivors remain, it's even more important to remember the atrocities of Nazi Germany and the suffering of the survivors and recommit ourselves to the vow never again. On a per capita basis, Australia is home to more Holocaust survivors than any other nation. From businessmen like Frank Lowy to artists like Judy Kassab, they and thousands of other people picked up their lives and took the opportunity to live in and serve this country. They changed the face of Australia. While my generation has had the privilege of meeting the survivors, by the time children born in a few years are old enough to understand what happened in the Holocaust, those survivors will be gone. For a coming generation, without the survivors, the danger is that the Holocaust will seem as long ago as the pogroms, the Crusades and slavery in Egypt. And then it will be up to us to tell the next generation our memory of the survivors and their story, to help turn our memories into the memories of the next generation. The importance of this task should not be underestimated. Sadly, we are witnessing a growth in Holocaust denial around the world in two forms. In the Muslim world as a way of playing into an anti-Jewish message that bolsters an anti-Israel message, and in the West fuelled by social media and a regression to what I've termed the pre-Enlightenment age, where people seem incapable of reasoning and assessing sources of information with the ability to tell fact from fiction. The prescient US General Dwight Eisenhower saw the potential for denial in April 1945. He wrote about Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald he'd just visited, saying, and I quote, "The things I saw beg a description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty and bestiality were so overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda." Eisenhower organised delegations of politicians, journalists and filmmakers to view first-hand what happened in the death camps in order to bear witness to a sceptical public. One journalist was asked if the scenes in the camp were as bad as they were described in the newspapers. He responded, no, they were worse. But as fewer of the remaining survivors are with us, it becomes much easier for people to say these horrific events never happened. What we can do is to educate the next generation so they view the Holocaust not as the experience of Jews, Roma, homosexuals or people with intellectual disabilities, but rather as a human experience where the most civilised and enlightened society on the planet can quickly turn into a monstrous barbarism and engage in murder on an industrial scale. I want to commend the Morrison government for its focus on Holocaust education, with $3 million for the Anti-Defamation Commission to create a Holocaust education platform and giving Australians a chance to visit Holocaust museums, with over $23 million in announcements and funding committed to building and extending Holocaust museums in Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide and Canberra. Whenever I visit a Holocaust museum, what moves me most are the sections dedicated to the righteous among the nations. Those non-Jews who risked their lives and those of their families to help save Jews even when they were strangers. Their sense of morality caused them to act. Their example is the fundamental lesson of the Holocaust, that it's never good enough to be a bystander, that we must confront evil and we must play our own part in correcting racial prejudice and keeping it at bay. It's difficult to say something original about the Shoah, but last year Australian Holocaust survivor Eddie Jaku did. I have the privilege of knowing Eddie's family. At 100 years of age, he wrote an international bestseller called The Happiest Man on Earth. Eddie Jaku had so many chances to escape the suffering he experienced. He was given a false identity to study, but returned to his hometown on Kristallnacht to see his neighbours turn on him and his family. He ended up on the beaches at Dunkirk as it was being evacuated, but couldn't get a place in a boat. He was hidden by a family in Belgium. He escaped from Buchenwald and Auschwitz, where his parents were murdered, but each time was recaptured. He ultimately escaped from the Auschwitz death march to be rescued by American soldiers. What sustained him was his useful mastery of machines and his friendship with Kurt Hirschfeld. What makes this epic tale so special is the humanity and wisdom of someone who has every right to be angry at the world, but who has, through reflection on his long life, been grateful for family, friendship and the kindness of strangers, and whose victory over Hitler is to live a happy life and to give happiness to others. His philosophy is powerful. You must remember you're lucky to be alive. Every breath is a gift. Life is beautiful if you let it be. Happiness is in your hands. Eddie JQ's life is witness to the truth that we must never forget our own humanity and the humanity of others. That is the ultimate lesson of the Holocaust.
Order. I call the member. Is the motion seconded? I call the member for McNamara.
Yes, thank you, Acting Speaker, and I'm happy to second the motion in the name of the member for Barawa. International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27 this year was significant for me personally, and I want to take this moment to acknowledge the Treasurer, who reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to pen a joint op-ed for the Fairfax papers on the significance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we did, and I'm very grateful that that was published, and I want to take this opportunity to thank him for his generous approach, and of course for the member for Barawa for also putting forward this important motion. This is a topic, and the recognition of history is something that I will always stand with anyone in any side of this place, and I know that those on the opposite have a similar view, that it is not a matter of partisanship, but a matter of what it is to be an Australian, to recognise the history, to recognise the fouls that happened, and to make sure that we all commit ourselves to it never ever happening again. I want to also take this moment to acknowledge the significant investment that the government has made recently around Holocaust education, and not just in Melbourne and Sydney, but in the ACT, in Queensland, and in other parts of the country as well. And I believe the ambition is to have some form of Holocaust education centre in every major capital city, and I think that is a wonderful initiative and one that we absolutely support here on this side of the House. And the reason why it's so important is because Australia has always stood in direct contrast to what happened in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. Australia and Melbourne, my hometown, actually was, per capita, had some of the highest population of Holocaust survivors in the world. It was a place where people had fled persecution and found safety and security in the wonderful multicultural community that is Australia. My grandmother was one of those people. She left Germany in October 1938, 1 week before the Kristallnacht, and she eventually, via a very long boat trip via Canada, made her way to Melbourne, Australia, to as far away as possible on the other side of the planet to the world that she left behind. Unfortunately, the family that she left in Germany didn't escape. They were some of the first that were sent to Auschwitz in 1941, but I am eternally grateful to this nation and to this country for being a refuge and for being a safe place for my grandmother and for the family that she was able to establish here in Australia, and like so many other survivors. I also want to take this opportunity that not only was the contrast for Australia for welcoming survivors, but the week after the Kristallnacht, of course, we had one of the only private protests against the treatment of Jewish people in 1938 by an Indigenous man called William Cooper, who the member for Cooper's seat is named after. And he, despite not even having the right to vote in Australia, marched from Footscray to the German High Consul to deliver a letter of protest to the German government to pronounce his protest against the treatment of Jewish people on the other side of the world. A truly remarkable and selfless act, and one that shows his commitment to human rights, not just for his people but for all people around the world. And that's really what Holocaust Remembrance Day is all about. It is not exclusively to mark the atrocities that happened against the Jewish people, because it was crimes committed based on people's religion, race, gender, sexuality, political views. The Nazi regime persecuted people based on things that people had no control over, things that people were born into. And that, again, is a contrast to what we have in Australia. But I would finish this, and my final point that I would make on this debate and in this place is to reaffirm Australia's commitment to the lessons of the Holocaust and to the lessons against persecution. Only over summer, Acting Speaker, we saw in the Grampians, in my home state of Victoria, I would describe as a display of confidence by neo-Nazi figures in Victoria. They were so confident that they were able to show their true signs and their true colours, despite absolutely hypocritically waving the Australian flag while doing so, and while doing the Sieg Heil in the Grampians of Victoria. And I would just say to the House that there is nothing less Australian than and then demonstrating pro-neo-Nazi symbols and gatherings than what was there. That Australians fought and died fighting the Nazi regime, and we remain committed to learning the lessons of the Holocaust and to make sure that it never happens again.